academic by background, a former editor by profession, and a lifelong history geek by her own admission. That's I think, a term that you embrace with pleasure. Jennifer Robson is the author of 3 novels set and after during the First World War, Somewhere in France, After the War is Over, and Moonlight Over Paris, and a contributor to the anthology Fall of Poppies, Stories of Love and the Great War. Her next novel, Every Time We Say Goodbye, will be published in the spring of 2017. She first learned about the Great War from her father, acclaimed historian Stuart Robson, and later served as an official guide at the Canadian National Vimy Memorial at Vimy Ridge, France. We were hearing a bit about that experience last night. She studied French literature and modern history as an undergraduate at King's University College here at Western, then attended St. Anthony's College at the University of Oxford, where she obtained her doctorate in British economic and social history. While at Oxford, she was a Commonwealth scholar and a SSHRC doctoral fellow. Ooh, that's impressive. She lives in Toronto right now with her husband and young children and shares her home with, as she says, Ellie, the sheepdog, and Sam, the cat. Let me turn it over to Paul and Jennifer.
So the plan is maybe I'll start with a reading. I'm going to stand up. I always feel when I'm doing a formal reading, I want to stand up and go to the podium. Also, it's easier to balance my notes. Anyone here's read Moonlight Over Paris, incidentally. If you remember the names of the characters, there's Sam as the hero, and Helena is the heroine, and her nickname over the course of the book it becomes Ellie. And it was only after I'd finished writing the book and shown it to my sister, and she said, "You do realize you named the hero and heroine of your book after your dog and cat." And I just was, and at that point it was I couldn't change it. So I think of it as a fond homage. The thing is, the cat very much is not in love with the dog in our home. So that's that's not a romance that's going very far. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read a chapter from my upcoming book, and there's actually late breaking news. As in earlier this week, I found out that my publisher in New York is not happy with the title Every Time We Say Goodbye. And since she's a really, really smart woman who knows way more about these things than I do, I had to admit she was probably right. And so in a panic, we came up. There's a lot of a number of calls back and forth to the William Morrow offices, and we came up with a new title of Dispatches from London. And I think it suits the book better because the story at its heart, there is a love story in the book, but the focus of the book is my heroine, Ruby Sutton, and she is a journalist during the Second World War. She's a staff writer for a magazine I invented called The American, and she's seconded to work at a British weekly news magazine called Picture Weekly. If anybody here grew up in Britain, you'd remember Picture Post from the period, and it is broadly based on or Picture Weekly is inspired by Picture Post. So she works for both the magazines. It's a way, they're both running on shoestrings, so it's a way for them to cut costs and get an extra journalist on board. And we see the war in London through her eyes. And Ruby is very much inspired by, she's not a version of, but she's inspired by my late grandmother, who was a journalist. Her name was Nikki Moyer. She started work as I guess the dog's body and general errand girl at the Vancouver News Herald in 1937. And by the end of the Second World War, was a full-fledged senior features writer at the Vancouver province, because she was one of the people who filled in for the men when they were at war. Among them, my grandfather, who was a staff officer and information officer, specifically with the RCAF in London. Grandma passed away 2 years ago, and I've still struggled with it. I miss her so much, and I wanted to honor her by writing about a woman journalist who lived through the same time as her. It's not Grandma's story. She's a very private person, and she'd probably have a fit at the thought of my talking about her in public. Sorry, Grandma. But I thought I could find seeds of inspiration in her own story, and I, in fact, first turned to her memoir that she'd written for the grandchildren, and Found all sorts of interesting details about what it was like to be a newspaper woman in those days. The one that struck with me most is when you went out to get a story, you came back with a story. There was no crawling back to your editor and saying, well, the people wouldn't talk to me, and it was, I couldn't find anyone to talk to, and I don't know if there's anything here. You had the column inches you were meant to produce, you produced them, that was that. There was no whinging allowed. So what I'm going to do is take you to London at the beginning of September 1940. Ruby has been living there for a couple of months, working at the magazine, which is on Fleet Street, and she lives nearby in Aldersgate, which is just to the east of kind of the Fleet Street region and not far from St. Paul's Cathedral. And where we pick up the story, she's been working, it's a Saturday. It's, in fact, September 7th, 1940. For history buffs, you'll know that's the first day of the Blitz. So it's Saturday, she's walking home after her morning at work. And I'll just mention now, there's a couple of other characters who will appear. There's a character called Kaz, that's his nickname. His full name is Walter Kazmarek, and he is the editor of the magazine and quite a towering figure in some ways. And there's a character called Captain Bennett who, well, I'm not going to say too much about Captain Bennett. He's rather mysterious, but if you've read my previous books, I think you have a sense already of who Captain Bennett may be. And then there's some incidental characters, but what we're seeing is the first day of the Blitz through the eyes of Ruby Sutton. Rather than walk straight home, she had lingered in the churchyard outside St. Paul's, letting the afternoon sun warm her face while she admired the stern simplicity of the cathedral's exterior. She hadn't yet worked up the nerve to venture inside. It had been years since she'd willingly gone to church, any sort of church, and even her curiosity wasn't enough, today at least, to propel her any further. Eventually, she wandered back to the hotel, and rather than take up the book she'd begun the night before, decided to type up the notes she'd made that morning. Would she ever tire of the sound and rhythm of her Underwood? The keys made such a pleasing noise as they struck the paper, and it was immensely satisfying to see the loops and dashes of her shorthand transformed into crisp, clean words. Secretarial college had been a long, drawn-out ordeal, but the skills she'd acquired had proved their worth many times over since then. Apart from Evelyn, she was the only person at PW who knew how to type properly. Everyone else just picked away with their index fingers. After an hour, perhaps more, she got up to open her window, for the room was becoming uncomfortably warm. She returned to her desk, her fingers poised above the typewriter keys, and that's when she noticed the noise. A rumble in the air, insistent and growing, unlike anything she'd ever heard. She went back to the window, leaned out as far as she dared, and craned her neck to see the sky above, though the neighboring buildings obscured all but a narrow strip of blue. Where a moment before there had been nothing but empty sky, there was now movement. The strip of blue became a pattern, speckled with black dots that swam in and out of focus, and the pattern was moving, the shapes above advancing in perfect formation. Airplanes, flying high above London. She checked her wristwatch, a few minutes past 5 o'clock. It wouldn't hurt to go outside and get a better look at what was happening. Perhaps she would be able to tell which sort of planes they were, or more likely rely on someone else to tell her. If only she had read and committed to memory the articles on identifying enemy warplanes that all the papers had been running, or had thought to cut one out for future reference. She had just started to lace up her shoes when the air raid siren began to howl. The sound didn't startle her, for the siren had become a backdrop to everyday life in recent weeks. A few times over the course of the past month, an enemy bomber had made it past the RAF and dropped a payload of bombs on outlying suburbs, but casualties and damage had been slight so far. There was no time to spare. She put on her coat, stuffed her notebook and pencil into her bag, and ran down the stairs to the hotel's basement. Her camp bed in the corner was waiting for her, and the same familiar faces of the other boarding guests were there, and nothing felt very different. Except she could tell that it was different. They all could. She ought to be making notes. The sounds she could hear from outside, the demeanor of the other people in the basement, her thoughts as she waited for the all clear. But she couldn't bring herself to take out her notebook. Not yet. Not until she had a better idea of what was going on. The sounds from outside were indistinct and impossible to interpret, muffled as they were by the basement's thick stone foundations. Of course, that was a good thing, for whatever was happening must be far away, but it did make the waiting a much more fearful experience. The rising drone of the all clear sounded after an hour, and rather than return to her room, Ruby went straight outside, as did most of the people who had been in the basement shelter with her. Nothing seemed all that different, not at first glance, but then she turned to the horizon, towards the rosy glow of the setting sun. And it dawned on her that she was facing east, not west. She dug in her bag for the A to Z that Captain Bennett had given her, but even with its help, she couldn't pinpoint the source of the fire or fires that were staining the sky red. Was it Whitechapel or Stepney? Rotherhithe or the Isle of Dogs? Had the docks and warehouses been hit? There was no way to tell, not without a bird's eye view of the city. It seemed a bit pointless to just stand on the sidewalk, so she went back inside and ate her share of the meager supper, bread and margarine, jam and tea the hotel's kitchen staff had been able to produce. No water coming in from the mains, Maggie explained, and the gas line has been switched off too. Oh, I don't mind. I wasn't all that hungry anyway. Oh, best to eat up all the same. Never know when they'll be back. At 8 o'clock, the sirens sounded again, so down they all trooped to the basement, guests and hotel staff sitting cheek by jowl in the dim and fairly damp shelter. A few stalwart souls tried to start up conversations with their neighbors, but earned only disapproving glares for their troubles. Instead, everyone seemed intent on charting the noises filtering through from outside, the rumbling hum of the bombers, the dull crump of falling bombs, the ineffectual bark of too few anti-aircraft guns. Whatever was happening in the East End was still an abstraction, a calamity that felt palpably distant. And yet, Ruby thought, the simple fact that she could hear the bombs meant that she wasn't anywhere near distant enough. In that moment, the opposite side of the ocean felt very much like the right place to be. The all-clear sounded just shy of dawn. Desperate for some fresh air, she stumbled up the stairs and straight outside, but there was no relief to be found. Smoke hung heavy in the air, overlaid by a terrible stench that clawed at her nose and throat. She fumbled in her bag for a handkerchief, desperate to dull the smell, and held it over her face. It's from the docks. One of the hotel cooks, still wearing his cap and apron, came forward to stand next to her. Whatever was in the warehouses, down in the docks, it's on fire now. Lumber, paraffin, sugar, tar spirits, it's all on fire. That's what you smell. Ruby nodded, her throat too dry to speak. I've got family down Stepney way, he said. I hope, he began, his words trailing off. He turned away, shaking his head, and went back inside. Her eyes gritty from lack of sleep, or perhaps just from the smoky air, Ruby started walking. She didn't have a destination in mind, but anything would be better than returning to her room. She didn't have a radio, and the morning papers wouldn't have news of what happened. She had to see for herself. 15 minutes later, she was at the Thames, a few yards from the northern end of Southwark Bridge. Others had gathered at its railings, likely feeling just as restless and bewildered, and she went to join them. Tower Bridge was due east, nearly a mile distant, its distinctive silhouette still intact, but every landmark beyond had been blotted out by spiraling towers of oily black smoke and a dawn sky painted crimson by fire. She turned her attention to the people around her, and her heart seized with sympathy. Haggard, disheveled, they were carelessly dressed in whatever garments had been at hand when the raid began. One man had belted a raincoat over his pajamas. All bore the same expression: exhausted, frightened, wary of what was to come, and yet grimly determined to endure. The bombers returned the next night, and the next, and the next, until it was hard to recall what life had been like before sirens and shelters and scattered moments of agitated, restive sleep. Only the unfailing routine of work kept her sane, or so she convinced herself, and she was needed at work day in and day out, For the hours they spent in the shelters almost every day meant they were hard-pressed to get the magazine out on time. Stories of the Blitz, as people had begun to call it, became her and Mary, the photographer's, bread and butter. And much of what she contributed was sent on to New York for the use in the American as well. The world was watching London, it seemed, and it was avid for any insight into the wellspring of courage that had arisen to sustain the city's people. Less than a week into the bombings, Ruby and Mary traveled east to Silverton, a working-class enclave sandwiched between the Royal Albert Docks and the Thames, and ringed round with petroleum depots, a chemical works, a sugar refinery, a gas plant, and scores of warehouses packed full of flammable goods. A single spark would have been enough to set off a powerful blaze in Silverton. A sustained assault by the Luftwaffe had been enough to level it. It seems opportunistic, Ruby had protested when Nigel had assigned the story earlier that week. We could end up doing more harm than good. Every other paper and magazine in the country is going there, he'd insisted. But you want us to miss the story because you're worried about hurting some dock workers' delicate feelings. I only meant... I know what you meant, Kaz interrupted. The thing is, we do need the story. That's a given, but you can get it without upsetting anyone. Ask as few questions as possible. Let people talk. That's what you need to remember. Just let them talk. So they had gone to Silverton and walked along its ruined streets and spoken with anyone who was in the mood to answer questions. Some turned away when they saw Ruby with her notebook and Mary with her camera. A few had broken down, unable to speak, but most had willingly, if not cheerfully, submitted to her questions. The best interview, the one Ruby would remember for the rest of her life, was with the first man they met there. He was sitting on a block of rubble, his face and clothing coated in a layer of fine gray dust, a figurine of a Staffordshire dog clutched to his chest. Behind him were the smoldering ruins of a row of modest houses. "Good morning," she said, her mouth dry with nerves. "My name's Ruby Sutton, and I'm from Picture Weekly. This is my colleague, Mary Buchanan. I apologize for bothering you, but would you mind speaking with us?" She held her breath, certain that he would refuse. "Pretty girls like you? Of course I don't mind. Come around to see the pasting we got from Jerry." Our boys chucked it back at them last night, though. Air Raid Warden was telling me so just this morning. Sent them limping back home to lick their wounds." "Well, they certainly did. Was this your house?" "It was. The one on the end. Not much of it left now." "But you rescued your dog." He looked down, surprised by what she'd said, and realized she was talking about the figurine he held. "Oh, right. Only half the pair. It was my mum's. She'd be mad as a wet hen if she saw I'd let one of them get broken." "Do you feel up to telling me what happened?" "I was down at the pub when the siren started. Near soon as we heard it go, the bombs started falling thick and fast. So we hid out in their cellar, tight as sardines, till the all clear sounded. There was so much smoke that morning, I could hardly see my hand in front of my face. My house, it was gone when I got home. Most of the street with it. I'm so sorry." The couple that lived next door, they were nice, they were. They kept to themselves, but were still friendly. She needed a cane to walk, and he always said he'd never leave her behind. Warden said, they tried to hide under the stairs, but the house fell on them, and then the fire. He turned his head away, swiping at his eyes with his sleeve, and Ruby found herself blinking back tears as well. "I felt bad, he went on, going down the pub so early on a Saturday. My missus would have given me holy hell for it. But if I'd been home, I would have gone to the shelter on Oriental Road. It's the nearest. And it got a direct hit that night. Everyone was killed." Your wife?" she asked gently, fearing the worst. "Oh, she died a few years back. Would have done her in to see the house like this." Ruby knelt in the dirt next to him, not caring if she ruined her stockings. "Do you have anywhere to go?" He didn't answer, his eyes focused on a point just over her shoulder, and for a moment she feared she had gone too far. And then he straightened up, leveled his shoulders, and looked her in the eye. "I'll be fine, don't you worry. My daughter lives down past Lewisham. She's on her way to fetch me now. Just came back today to see if there's anything I could fish out of the rubble." "I'm so sorry this happened to you, Mr. Jemmett. You can call me Bill. When you must call me Ruby. Is there anything I can get for you? There's a mobile canteen down the road. I could bring you some tea." "Nah, I'll be all right. Thanks anyway." As Ruby and Bill talked, Mary had been taking pictures steadily, almost stealthily, and if it hadn't been for the click and zip of her camera, it would have been so easy to forget she was there. She came forward now and tapped Ruby on the shoulder. "It's time to move on." "Well, Mary is right, I'm afraid. Would you mind if we used your name and photograph in the magazine? The article will probably run in next week's issue." "Would I mind? It'll be the talk of the street, I will." Of course, there was no street, not anymore. "You're very brave," Ruby told him impulsively. "I'm sure your wife would be really proud of you." "Well, nice of you to say so." "You got me wondering, though, what brought you all the way from America, if you don't mind me asking? Time like this, I'd have thought you'd stay put. Safer over there." "Oh, but not at half as interesting. I wouldn't have got to meet you if I'd stayed at home, would I? Good luck, Bill. And good luck to you, Ruby." At the end of September, unable to sleep after the third cycle of siren, shelter, and all clear since dusk, she wrote an hour-by-hour description of living through a night of bombing. The call of the siren, the rush for shelter, the hours of waiting, the dreadful anticipation of what morning would bring. She rewrote it at least a dozen times before working up the courage to show Kaz, and still she was uncertain. The man read faster than anyone she'd ever met, but it was a long while before he looked up from her typewritten pages. "I like it, I do, but it's not quite right, is it? I knew it. There's something missing, but I can't." "It's missing you," he said. "It's missing your point of view. Rewrite this in the first person. Tell the readers who you are and how you came to be here." "But it's not my place to editorialize," she protested. I meant to stand aside so the reader..." "Did you learn that from your editor in New York? As far as I know, he's never had to endure an aerial bombardment for, well, what day is it today? Monday the 30th. For 23 straight nights and counting. Your first day here, you told me you were an outsider. You said you wanted to stand back and observe. I did, but so? Now you're in the thick of things. You're in the middle of the split, same as we all are. You might as well be honest about it." Dispatches from London by Miss Ruby Sutton, September 30th, 1940. I don't think I could describe it if I hadn't lived through it. It's as simple as that. The fear of the bombs is real enough, and if there's a man or woman in London who isn't scared during the raids, I'd like to borrow some of their courage. It's their good humor that surprises me. How this city can paste a smile on its collective face and still get to work, more or less on time, still get the jobs done that need doing, and apart from a wobbly moment here or there, still find things to joke and sing and laugh about, I haven't yet figured out. When I do, I'll let you know.
Well, I'm definitely going to buy that. Jennifer, that's quite a experience for me to see students get so successful. I've had a number of successful students over the years, but so far you are the first, and to be honest, the only best-selling author to emerge.
It surprises the heck out of me, I have to say.
It's possible that the first time you had an official visit to London for a book launch, so many of the people may have read your book, but they haven't necessarily heard you speak. Perhaps a short little story of how you came from being an academic with an academic career ahead of you, and suddenly you end up as a best-selling author.
It starts with being a failed academic, to be perfectly honest, in that when I finished at Oxford in 97, I think, I did that dreadful 3-hour oral defense, and I still makes my palms sweat to think about that. And I had my freshly minted DPhil, But there weren't any jobs. There were no teaching jobs in European history, and they're as scarce as the proverbial hen's teeth even now. And after looking for a while and really was running out of money, to be perfectly honest, I came back to Canada, and I was fortunate enough to get a job as a very, very junior. We're talking the bottom of the editorial ladder at Elm Street magazine, which some people may remember. And from there, I started moving my way up, and I liked the work as an editor. I mean, it was pretty similar to a lot of the things I liked about academe. I mean, there was the writing, the researching, all of that, the attention to detail, and there weren't students. It depends on the particular student, doesn't it, whether or not that's a good or bad thing. But I would have liked to teach, but it just wasn't, I didn't have the opportunity. So I did that for about 15 years. I worked at various magazines. I worked at the Globe and Mail. And I ended up at Penguin Books Canada, which I loved. I loved working there. But when my son was born in 2004 and we looked at the finances, publishing is not known for the radically high compensation levels for especially junior staff. And I realized if I were to go back to work full time at Penguin, I would actually probably have to not only give all my pay to a caregiver, but then some. We would be in the hole. So I stayed home as a freelancer and kept doing that. And then by 2007, when my daughter was born, I was really hitting the wall in terms of hating the work I was doing. I mean, I was doing a lot of work for banks, translating the corporate baffle-gab into English. If you're good at it, really good at it, and you love it, it's good work, it's important work. But I didn't love it, and I was finding it really dispiriting. And I had a moment, which I think Mark Medley described it when he did that very nice piece in the Globe and Mail earlier this year, where I was up late watching the CBC, and they had a documentary on called A Year in the Life, and it followed Jo Rowling around in the year that her final Harry Potter book was being published. And I've always been a fan of hers, as well as her work, but her personally. And they took her back to Edinburgh, to the flat she'd been living in, the very, very dingy, crummy little flat, when she wrote the first Harry Potter book. And she was a single mom. She was on social assistance. She just had nothing to fall back on. There was no net to catch her, really. She said she was as skint as you could be without being homeless. It was really, really hard for her, and she didn't really have anyone she could just turn to and complain to, or who could help her out if she had a really hard day. And it was just her and her little girl. And out of this poverty of the world that surrounded her, she created this work of this. It's a beautiful, beautiful book, and she did that with nothing. And I had this moment. It was kind of like, I call it the anvil falling out of the sky. It really felt like an anvil had fallen out of the sky and hit me on the head. And I remember sitting there thinking, well, I've had this idea in my head for so long that I wanted to write a book about the Great War and have a woman as its heroine, and I keep saying I'm too busy and I don't have time, and when would I do it? And I realized that those were just pathetic excuses, that if I were ever to write that book, I had to start that moment. So I went out the next day and I bought a notebook and I started writing. And from there to getting published was kind of a long, slightly dispiriting at times odyssey that involved being rejected many, many times, until Downton Abbey became a hit in the United States. And if I ever meet Julian Fellowes, the creator of Downton Abbey, I'm not sure what I'll do. I'll probably follow at his feet, but that changed my life, because suddenly, where there wasn't a market for books set, or publishers had the perception that there was no market for books set at the time of the Great War, particularly books, commercial fiction that was aimed at a largely female readership. They were just a perception that no one would buy those books. The day after Downton Abbey premiered in the United States, there was a huge demand for those books, and I happened to have one ready to go. So from there, it's kind of been relatively smooth sailing, but it was one of those things where it took me 20 years to figure out what I wanted to do after I finished university. I think that's actually not atypical of a lot of writers. You fail at a lot of other things, and then you finally find the one thing that you're reasonably good at, and you think, I never have to go work in an office again as long as I live. Yay! Yeah.
That's very good. I should say that a lot of historians don't really enjoy reading historical novels, and even less looking at historical films, because they're always really bad. Yours was actually very good, because I do 18th century stuff mostly, but 19th century, maybe 20th, you were spot on. So I know that having a PhD in history from Oxford gives you an in. But what other kind of research did you have to do? Because you had to cover a lot of very technical items, ambulance driving away, aid stations and mashing at work, and all the rest of it. What other kind of research did you have to do?
I think anybody who's ever gone through, done a university degree, done any kind of research, it's a pretty typical model, right? Where you do the general survey, and then you keep kind of drilling down through the sources until you're at the primary sources. And here is, writing historical fiction now, I think in some ways is easier than it's ever been because of the digitization of many, many historical sources. So that when I was at King's doing, we were talking about when I was at King's and researching my papers for my history courses, I go to the library and see what was there, and if I was lucky, I could maybe get something an interlibrary loan. But I had to make do with what was there largely. When I was at Oxford, I did a lot of primary source research. I even did an oral history project that actually I dug out and then used again when I was writing my new book. But none of that was digitized. It was all a case of putting your bum in the chair and sitting there for endless, we're talking thousands of hours of reading, traipsing to archives and museums all over England, and then collating the results. And with the result, it took me about three and a half years to do the research for my degree, which turned on issues of clothing during the Depression and the Second World War, and how rationing affected people's patterns of consumption. It's so dull. If anyone needs a sleep aid, I can send you a PDF, and honestly, you'll be out by the third page. It's highly effective. My husband tried to read it, and he gave up after the first chapter. It really is that dull. But so 3.5 years to research it. My books now, and I don't put I don't have the time because of publishing deadlines to do as deep a dive, but I do as much as I can. I really, really want to feel I know my stuff when I write a book. But I don't have to travel the same way I had to. I can sit at my desk and go online to the National Archives, for example, which was not digitized at all when I was doing my DPhil. And now it's far from fully digitized, but a lot of the resources I need, particularly those pertaining to the First World War, have been digitized. And I mean, you do have to pay to look at them, but even at 50 pence a page view, you have to go through a lot of page views before you come anything close to the cost of a 2-week visit to London. I mean, it's a fraction of the cost. So I might end up spending, say, $500 per book on digital access to sources, as opposed to $5,000 or $10,000 on what it would cost for me to travel. And then it's just, there's so many things to look at. I mean, I what happens is I have to actually set myself dates where I cut myself off and I have to finish. Doesn't matter how curious I am, and then you fall down rabbit holes. One thing I found was the province of doing British history means you also have access to the wonderful British world of enthusiasts. So anything to do with travel, there's bound to be somebody who has a collection of train tickets from the 1920s with exact details of when, how much a ticket costs printed right on them. Or there are people who collect times tables, so you can find out when the trains ran. The ambulance that the ambulance which I nicknamed Henrietta in the first book, Somewhere in France, it's a Ford ambulance, and I had help from people who run the ambulance museum in Northern England, who helped make sure that I got it right when I was describing it. So that's one thing. I love kind of going to the message boards and introducing myself and saying, would anybody care to help me? And people are very generous, I have to say. It's been wonderful. So that, and even with the new book, the maps actually were one of the coolest parts of working the new book, because if you're writing about London during and after the Blitz, you have to be aware that the map of London changed profoundly, particularly in and around the ancient city of London, where Ruby lives and works. And you can't have somebody walking down a street that doesn't exist, either at that time or afterwards. So there have been a number of initiatives, largely by university and graduate students, who have digitized maps from the period, and then they've done overlays, so you can kind of dial back and forth between today's streets and the streets in 1940 and see how they've changed. And I did that so many times. I could lose a whole day plotting where Ruby was walking and making sure that it existed, and making sure that the buildings she's looking at are buildings that were there in, say, November 1940, that they hadn't been burned down. So yeah, this is, as you can, we could spend the next 7 hours with me blathering on about sources. It's terrible.
Okay, so a solid undergraduate education, 10 or 15 years of work experience. That's not on. Right. Yes, the solid undergraduate degree, 10, 15 years of work experience, great deal of inspiration, opportunity, some patience, and 3 years of hard research. So basically anybody can do it. If you're aspiring, you know roughly what you have to do.
Well, I think...
But I mean, what I said about the accuracy of the social background and the politics, it shows, and obviously it's based on an extremely firm foundation.
Well, I mean, it helps, yeah. I do. There's 20 years, maybe probably close to 30 years, if I count from around the time I landed at King's in 1988. Oh my gosh, that was a while ago, 28 years. And how should I put it? I've been reading constantly in that time, and somebody asked me, it was a great question at a reading not so long ago, how I was able to capture the people's speech cadences without making it sound like, sometimes you read historical fiction, they're trying to capture, say, Elizabethan speech, and it just sounds ridiculous. And so mannered. It's a case of reading a lot. I mean, reading a lot of fiction set in the period. Obviously, from the 1930s onwards, you have access to films set in the period. Not all of which are naturalistic enough in their approach that you can use them as models, but you get a sense of you have a kind of a sixth sense as to whether it sounds right or not. I was very careful with this book because my heroine, the new book that is, Dispatches from London, the heroine is American, and to not put British terms in her mouth, there's a conversation with her going back and forth with one of her British colleagues. So, for example, she, till fairly late in the book, refers to the radio as a radio and not a wireless, and her friends are calling it a wireless, but I can't have her using it because it's not a term that would have just kind of come naturally out of her mouth. Although, after 3 years, there's a moment where she starts referring it to wireless, and she accepts that she's adopted this new word, this new term for it. But it's easy to fall into, there's so many words we assume are older words than they actually are. I mean, none of us here would make the mistake of using the term okay if they're writing about something set in 1900. But there's lots of words you think, they sound like plaza, sounds like a word that somebody would have used in the 1920s. And I remember when my dad looked through the manuscript for Somewhere in France, and he loved it, thank God. I was really sweating it out when I was waiting for him to read it. But he came back and he had a list. It was mostly military things that I just got not quite right, and so little things that he wanted me. The difference between a CO and an OC, I had got that wrong, so he set me straight. And he said, oh, by the way, you can't use the word grotty. And I said, what do you mean I can't use the word grotty? Robbie's describing this terrible flat. It's a grotty little flat. And he said, no, you can't use it. The word was invented in the 1960s. I'm like, what are you talking about? And he said, go to the OED. Did you not run through the etymology of this word, Jennifer? And he said, go to the OED. I'm like, well, I don't actually have the full edition of the Oxford English Dictionary that runs to 40 volumes in my living room, Dad. So if you go to the Oxford English Dictionary, it has the etymology for every known English word. And when I looked up grotty, it appears first is traced to the 1960s. And the first kind of recorded use of it is in Yellow Submarine, and it's Ringo Starr who says it. So I had put a word in my character's mouth in 1917 that didn't, that Ringo Starr coined effectively. And I think at one point I used the word, I had somebody using a term of Freudian psychology, he referred to in his ego, again in 1917, 1918. And actually that time was my copy editor who caught it, and he said, you realize, Jennifer, nobody living outside Vienna in those days, and who wasn't on close speaking terms with Sigmund Freud, would have been using that term. I mean, it's a solid 10 years before it starts creeping into people's speech. But it's a balance. But also, if you make it sound exactly as people were speaking, it might actually end up sounding kind of goofy. When I was writing Ruby's columns or snippets of columns that go in at kind of the end of some of the chapters, I had to be careful not to hew too closely to the conventions of how newspaper columns were written in those days, because they do sound pretty goofy to modern ears. And so I had to get close to it, but not so close that people would be saying, whatever else Ruby is, she can't write her way out of a paper bag. So I don't know how she got this job at the magazine in London. But it's a balancing act, right? Of getting the details right without hammering the reader with so much that you feel as if you're getting info dumped. That's one of the terms that writers use. Are you succumbing to the dreaded info dump at the beginning of a chapter? I hope I don't. I mean, I probably do here and there. Feel free to write and let me know, and then I'll apologize.
One other question, this is the literary side coming out, I guess. Do you have any inspiration from other writers that have turned you on to the way you write, the way you see the world?
Oh God, yeah. That's another question we could be here for another 2 hours. The first writer of historical fiction that I remember putting the book down and then picking it up and reading it all over again and being blown away in the way that you feel almost breathless was Tracy Chevalier's book, A Girl with a Pearl Earring. And I still in some ways think it's the perfect work of historical fiction, because she catapults you into this world, and there's not a ton of detail. I mean, she's not you're not getting hit over the head with what 16th century Delft looked like, or I guess it's 17th century Delft. But you do have this sense. It's a profoundly immersive book, and it convinced me entirely. I mean, I can never look at that painting anymore without thinking that the woman I see is in fact Greet, and that her story is the story that Tracy Chevalier told me. I believe it entirely. She still is. I mean, she's like the kind of titan of historical fiction, and she doesn't write a ton of books, but the books she writes are spectacular. And then although it's not, he's not thought of as writing historical fiction, but he did. It was Robertson Davies. I mean, I remember reading What's Bred in the Bone. I still reread it every few years, and it's set. It begins before the Great War and continues through. I mean, he has scenes that are set during the Second World War, during the Blitz, that I still find heartrending to read. Those, and again, he had this kind of that light touch with the details but nonetheless, they were very immersive books. The first author who ever signed a book for me was Robertson Davies at Western, and I remember he had a calligraphy pen, and he signed his books in kind of a very old-fashioned italic script, one letter at a time. So the book would be opened for him, and then it would be R, O, B, and I remember still there's a huge lineup, as you can imagine, not only because a lot of people wanted to see Robertson Davies, who was then in his 80s, but also to have their book signed. And I could see the publicist standing there, and the woman was falling to pieces because it was, there was no way, and I could see she's thinking, we're never going to get through everyone. But he stayed and he signed everyone's books, but it took probably 5 to 10 minutes per book for him to sign, and I could the sweat on the woman's face. I really felt for her at the time, but I still have those books. That's one of my lovely literary memories.
Well, our time is getting a little bit, so perhaps we have anybody in the audience have any questions that they can ask of Jennifer?
There.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi.
Claire Boyce has a wonderful painting out in the lobby
Yeah.
of the King and Queen coming to London.
Oh,
in
really?
1939.
I'll
It's
totally look
amazing.
at it.
How do you pace yourself? Like, do you do sprint when you're writing? Do you sprint and then go outside?
Oh, that's a good question, because it's NaNoWriMo month, so,
Or do
you
you
know.
do like a 24-hour? Because I've done both.
Mhm,
I've done like where I really feel like I have to keep what I'm working on in my head.
Yeah.
Constantly, and sometimes I'll have to do like 20 minutes, then sort of go off and breathe and then come back. And
Oh, I hear you, yeah.
What works?
So it's a bit of both. A lot of what I do, it's a practical thing. It's informed by what are my children doing and where do I have to be at any given time to make sure that they're not standing by the side of the road wondering what happened to their mom. And now that they're both in school, when I first started writing, I had one who was at home with me, and I would write at the weirdest times just to make sure I was still, paying attention to her. I do the bulk of my writing during the day. I find mornings are a really good time. Afternoons, my dad always calls it's the hitting the fudge wall around 3, and you just feel like you're like an insect caught in sap or something. You just can't even move or think. That's often when I do the catching up with mail, people who've written to me and things like that. And then I go back for a second stint after dinner, after my kids are in bed. That's at a fairly leisurely pace in the early stages, but what invariably happens is I'm getting closer to deadline, then I'm writing for longer and longer periods and more sustained kind of bursts, as you say, of just having to get it down. I'm a big believer in just, Anne Lamott has talked about, I won't use the actual word, but she said, you owe yourself a terrible first draft. The word she doesn't use the word terrible, but just getting that first draft down is, for most writers, the hardest part. Now, I know I have some friends who say the first draft is easy, it's the editing that kills them. It's the opposite for me. But, whatever you can do, whatever works for you as a writer, I think, there's no hard and fast. But I have to say, as I get close to deadlines, and I'll be writing for sometimes 10 hours a day, and looking increasingly like a ghoul, to tell you the truth. So, anyone else? Yes, in the middle. Oh, great.
I'd be really interested, Jennifer, in what other women, historical novelists, have influenced you. I'm trying to think of the author of Wolf Hall, whom I adore.
Yeah.
Or Philippa Gregory.
Philippa Gregory, yeah. So I love both those women. I was telling Paul earlier, next summer I'm appearing on 3 different panels of the Historical Novel Society in Portland. And Margaret George, has anybody here read Margaret George's books, the tremendous Tudor biographies? She's this titan of historical fiction. I was asked to be in a panel with her, and my palms are sweating just thinking about it right now. I've gotten to know quite a lot of, especially the women, American writers who are doing historical fiction, and I have huge respect for. Beatrice Williams is someone I unreservedly recommend her books. Lauren Willig as well. They're all writing kind of books set in mid-century. Although Beatrice has a new series that's set in Jazz Age New York, which the first one lands in January. And I was hoping to get an early copy, and then I forgot to remind my publicist, so I have to get my hands on it. Christina Mcmorris is a Portland-based writer. She's written about the Japanese-American experience in the Second World War profoundly. I love her work. Hazel Gaynor is another recent favorite of mine. She's an Irish writer Actually, I will say, she's from Yorkshire. She lives in Dublin, so English-Irish. And her most recent book, The Girl from the Savoy, is about a woman who's an actress in the West End stage in the middle part, before the Second World War, and it is tremendous. And it was just actually nominated for, I think, the National Book Awards in Ireland. Highly, highly recommend Hazel's work. Are we time for one more, or are we running up against?
Let's go with one more.
Okay. There's somebody else right in the middle.
Jennifer, you speak of the influence that your father had with regards to your career.
Oh, absolutely.
How about your mom?
Oh, well, that's it's like you're a plant there, because I'll do anything to talk about my mom. My mom actually did have a sustained, profound effect on me, and the lovely man who wrote the article in the alumni magazine, it was so sweet that he did ask me about her, and I got really choked up actually when I was talking about her. So she was a family lawyer in Peterborough for most of my life, and in the latter years of her life, she was only 51 when she died. She had cancer, but she was a family court judge, and she was the person in Peterborough you went to if your husband was beating you up and you needed to get out. She was the person you went to, and she would fix things for you. Before there was a shelter in Peterborough, she was the person who fulfilled that role, as it were. And just a tremendous person, and funny, warm. Everything about my mom I love. She was also a history buff, and she loved the big doorstopper historical novels, the MMK. Has anyone ever read The Far Pavilions by MMK? She loved anything to do with the Raj. She had this dream to go and visit the Vale of Kashmir, and no matter how many times my father said, "You do realize there's been a terrible civil war going there for years, like it's not safe to visit it." She had this vision of visiting the Vale of Kashmir. But she would have these doorstopper novels that I would then pick up. And they were writing in historical fiction in the 80s, the 70s and 80s. I mean, people were writing 600-page books, which would, not many people are getting those published today, except say Ken Follett. But she loved talking about history as much as my dad did. I mean, she did history as an undergraduate, which I always forget. I mean, she went and did her second degree was in law, and she was also the holder of the family history, in that my great grandfather had been a soldier in the First World War. He was everywhere. He was at Passchendaele. And came back. He survived, but he came back a changed man. And then my grandfather, her father was overseas during the war with the RCAF, and he was attached to Bomber Command, and again was very, very affected by what he saw and experienced. So she was, and I guess the one disappointment or moment of difficulty for me in all of this is that she never got to read any of my books. And even my grandmother, who actually her health had gone downhill and she'd had a stroke and wasn't able to read by the time the first book came out, was never able to read them. And so the two women who've had the most influence on me, weren't, but I like to feel that Mom is kind of following along and cheering me on, and that she would see something of herself in the books. Certainly, if you've read the second book, After the War's Over, the character of Charlotte is, broadly speaking, she's modeled. She isn't the same person, but she's inspired by both my mom and my sister. That's where I found Charlotte, I would say. Yeah. Okay. Come up and ask me questions. I'm not going to run off immediately. So.
Well, join me in thanking both Paul, Webb, and Jennifer Robson.